Hi, this is Dale Dougherty of Make Magazine, and I'm here with Steven Levy, who is the author of Hackers, which has just been republished in the 25th anniversary edition by O'Reilly. And we're at Food Camp, and I thought I'd grab Steven a little bit to talk about obviously this is the early days of what you call the computer revolution. And one of the thoughts I have in reading the book is it's like when if you're a baseball fan, you go back and read 50 years ago or something about old players like Ty Cobb or something, and you go, oh, that's who he was and that's what he did, and really so many interesting players coming together in this book. But it's 25 years old, so you published it in '85, and
Right.
It really covers the period from kind of the sort of early '60s up until the early
Right.
'80s.
Right. Yeah, it's the glory of our times is the baseball book that talks about the very early days, and it's very much like that there. I think of those guys, particularly the folks at MIT in the late '50s and early '60s, as sort of these pioneers, and you see them almost in sepia, working on these giant room-sized computers, really inventing hacker culture and inventing a lot of the internal policies that drive innovation today, really.
Right, and it fascinates me, and obviously the connection to, say, Make Magazine today, but to see that, at MIT, this is a model railroad club.
Yeah.
And I like to think, as you explain it, there's sort of a group that likes to worry about the terrain on the top of the board, and there's a group underneath that's worrying about switches. And they sort of are the ones that get that get the idea that computers might help them practically.
Yeah, definitely. They called themselves the S&P people, the signals and power people, and they didn't really have much patience for painting the conductor with a little paintbrush and getting the trees just right. They were underneath the table. They had some connections with Bell Telephone, where they were able to get these telephone switching devices, and really built in essence was a computer underneath this model railroad layout. You'd look on the top and it would be the kind of thing you'd see in a toy store at Christmas time, and underneath it looked like the power room of a submarine or something, with all these switches and and very complicated electricity feeding into this and that, where they can control the trains in really sophisticated ways. And it was sort of like a computer underneath that, and they actually called working underneath this thing on the signals and power things hacking. And that was really, I think, the first use of the word hacking in that electronics sense. And it was amazing to see how they referred to themselves as hackers and talked about the hacking spirit there.
Right. And many, this was a club at MIT.
Yeah.
And really it was a set of hobbyists that were taking on stuff, but doing it at a pretty serious level, obviously.
Yeah, they would go to the local junkyards and scavenge for interesting equipment that might got thrown out there. There's a lot of defense contractors in the Boston, Cambridge area, and stuff would just get thrown out, amazing stuff that they would salvage and work into this. And then the key moment was when the Lincoln Labs, which is a research operation funded by the Defense Department, donated a computer to MIT that went next to the Model Railroad Club, and the people just shifted their operations from the railroad operation to this computer called the TX0, and they wound up being the first people to really explore interactive computing instead of submitting cards to some priest of the computer and waiting a couple days till they got the result. They would do that in real time, late at night, of course, and basically had the $1 million computer to play in.
Right, and you talk about something that really comes out of this kind of a hands-on imperative, and its simplest manifestation is simply we want to get our hands on that technology and take it apart, find out how it works, and begin to utilize it.
Right, as talking to these people, and it wasn't just the MIT people, it was the people in the Homebrew Computer Club and the game hackers, and basically anyone who was just passionately involved in hacking and to seeing where you can go with a computer. You would ask them about what they were like as kids, and it would be the same story over and over again. They'd take things apart. They'd usually turn off the power in the house by sticking something into the plugs. They would, a lot of them had this weird fixation with explosives, and they just had to get their hands on things. And when something stood between them and the ability to manipulate the things around them, they just they blew past the obstacle. Whether it might be some regulation or it might be somebody saying you can't go there.
Administration.
Yeah. They would just go past it. And there's great stories of some of the people at MIT just infuriating some of the bureaucracy who had a possessive attitude towards their tools, say, or even the idea that you weren't allowed to go and tinker with this $1 million computer. They had no compunction about going in there and maybe improving the circuitry.
Right. And I think the interesting thing is it isn't just what they did, it's almost how they construct a belief system around what they're doing, why it means something. And that's really when we talk about things like culture, they were really creating a culture, probably not completely conscious that they were doing so at the time.
That's very true. They didn't think of it so much in that way. At a certain period, as it evolved from the Model Railroad Club group to Project Mac, which turned into the AI lab at MIT. At that point, I think maybe some of them started realizing this is our culture, this is our thing, without really any impulse to spread it around too much. But they had built around that ethic that you should get your hands on things and that information should be free, which was another real shared belief that they had. Their style of creating things for the computer was totally open. Quite literally, when they wrote a program, it would be stored back then in paper tapes, and they'd keep it in a drawer by the computer. And anyone could open up that drawer, pull out that tape, run the program, change the program, put the tape back in there. There wasn't an ownership ethic. You didn't put your name on it, though if you did something really great, everyone knew who did it. It fomented the belief that these things don't belong to anyone. They belong to everyone.
Right. Now you kind of make a distinction that sort of East Coast and MIT had kind of an intellectual version of this, and then you kind of switch to the West Coast, Berkeley, and it comes out a little bit differently, kind of wrapped up with activism and we want to change the world, a much more of a social mission. Yeah,
it was kind of interesting. There was this great moment at MIT, I don't know if it was a great moment, but a significant moment when the Vietnam protests were raging. And people associated what they were doing, some of it was defense funded, with the war effort. And this was totally not in their thinking. They didn't think in terms of politics. They were just doing really cool things and really amazing things. The things they wound up doing turned out to be the things that we do with computers. They were the first ones to do things like word processing or things like that, which were generally thought of as a waste of the computer's time, right? They thought it was cool, or computer games. They really invented video games out there. But they were shocked when people were surrounding their building and protesting against it. Whereas on the West Coast, I think things are more blended with what was going on there, with the stuff happening in Berkeley and otherwise. And there was more of a little hippie-ish aspect to the Stanford AI lab that it eventually wound up maybe merging a little with some of the roots of personal computing.
Right, but you mentioned the game, and I just wanted to make the comment that it was, that part of them were really exploring because it was fun. I mean, it wasn't, and while we say intellectual, part of it was just gratifying to be able to do new things.
Yeah.
And they would discover something, but they were making a Space Wars game. And I mean, that's how simple it was. It was not something unlike what a 13-year-old might do today.
Right, and it was an incredibly fun game, but also they did really cool things with it. Like someone made sure that the stars in the background of the Space War game mapped with real constellations. Right, they weren't just random pinpoints of light there. And since the computer was so expensive, they called it expensive planetarium, the little routine that put those stars up. So they were hacking really neat things to do there, and they hacked hyperspace and all kinds of fun things in there. So the fun for a lot of the people was much more creating things and doing cool things with a game as it was playing with it. Though they went deep into the night doing that.
Right. And yet, what kind of connects the two sides is really this personalization of technology, of just grabbing hold of it. And the thing as a magazine publisher, it stands out for me is the 1975 publication in Popular Electronics, the Altair computer. And that's really a big deal.
Well, that opened it up. And then again, this was a concept that a lot of people in the computer world just didn't see at all. The idea of a personal computer, they thought, what an oxymoron that is. I mean, how could you have a personal computer? These are big things for big, important tasks. Yet the people who had that spirit and that openness and that hands-on imperative, they saw this magazine article saying that you could build your own computer for $500. And they started literally camping out in the parking lot of the place that was going to do this, because it really wasn't a product. It was sort of a vaporware originally. And as soon as the first kits came out, they built the kits and started doing things that no one thought they could do with it.
Right. And the interesting thing, Ed Roberts just passed away in the last year, right? And he's the founder of MITS, is it called?
Right, yeah.
And it's in New Mexico.
It was based in Albuquerque, and where he was, and he was a really interesting guy. I fortunately got to talk with him. And he had that vision. He told me that he compared it to the pyramids. It took 10,000 men to build a pyramid, but with a computer you could do the mental work of 10,000 people there. Mm-hmm. And he actually saw the revolutionary possibilities of it. And then, of course, a couple kids from Harvard
read the magazine.
Yeah, read the magazine and said, wow, the train's pulling out of the station. The revolution's here. We got to get to do this. And of course, Bill Gates and Paul Allen wrote the first basic computer language for the thing. And I think it's worth mentioning that back then, what you did with a computer is you program things with it. You couldn't do anything on the Altair without a computer language. The BASIC enabled you to build things with it. But even when you bought the first so-called consumer computers, like an Apple, you booted up the Apple, and the first thing you saw was a prompt for BASIC. This was a machine that you could write things to do things with. It wasn't something that you just ran a program and there it was. Yeah. You made your own apps.
Right. But that was such a breakthrough, to be able to do that on your own. And again, the predecessors were waiting in line. What was it? One of the places they had to pay 50 cents an hour to get access to a large mainframe in Cambridge or something.
That wasn't just incredibly cheap. That was the subsidized thing. Yeah, just the idea that time on these things was thought to be so valuable, and they could only do important things, and to have fun with it was a heresy, right? And that was just the total opposite of what the hackers did. Whether they were doing, sometimes they did interesting things for the graduate students or the professors and things like that, but mainly their idea was to make great tools so you could build more tools, or to do really interesting, fun things, or math hacks or whatever.
Right. They didn't necessarily see these as broad consumer things yet, but they were their own consumers.
Yeah.
And Roberts had a small company losing a fairly good amount of money.
Yeah.
But this magazine article just turns everything around.
Right. Yeah. And even so, he never really made a great business out of it. And it was really not for a general public. You had to put this thing together. It was really hard. And you got your soldering iron, and you had to follow these directions. I don't know how good they were, but these people figured out, because they built clubs around building them. Right. So to help each other out. That's another just important thing of these cultures is, even though they weren't necessarily the most social people, they bonded together because they could help each other in figuring out this stuff.
And that is really a strong thread throughout the book, which I still think we see today, even at events like Food Camp here. It's just that coming together, physically exchanging ideas. In those cases, sometimes they were exchanging software, they were exchanging designs. And so the most famous of those clubs, probably the Homebrew Computer Club.
Definitely. And, it was the first real computer club, and that was built around the Altair. Other people in the West Coast saw this thing was coming, and they one guy just put up a notice saying, hey, who wants to help build these things? And one of the people who answered the call was Steve Wozniak. And the first Apple was built as a homebrew computer club project. And there were a couple other companies which, for the grace of God, could have been Apple. There was one great computer called Sol, which was the star at that time, not the Apple. And all sorts of other projects. It really was the beginning of the personal computer industry.
And many of the people that you also, in the sense time forgets about, is the kind of the evangelist, the people. I think it's Ed Felsenstein.
Lee Felsenstein.
Lee Felsenstein, sorry, and just going out and talking to kids and asking them, do they want to program computers?
Yeah,
and he was surprised that so many did.
Yeah, it was interesting. Lee was an interesting character, and he's sort of the center, as you know, the second part, because he was one of the few people in that hacker world around then who really saw it as an overtly political act. And he had been involved in the free speech movement at Berkeley, and though he was a nerd and an engineering kind of guy, and he helped build this thing called community memory out there in Berkeley, which was a system where just plain people who weren't necessarily computer people can go and use the things for social networking, really. Within the terminals that connected this thing, they had sort of like a Craigslist's the kind of operation going there, and people expressed themselves on it, and there were like weird characters who came up there, maybe some early version of blogging, you could almost call it. And this was all done as an overtly political act that he felt the computers were going to empower people and overthrow the entrenched forces or whatever.
Right, and as you mentioned earlier about for other people, and particularly the activists, they saw technology as evil or associated with things like the military. There is this small other group that really. You could almost say, in a certain way, wins the day.
Absolutely.
If you think about all the things that went on in the 60s, many of these ideas really start there, and they're still pretty active in ways that things like free love aren't.
So I was researching this book in the early '80s, and just the first headiness of the computer revolution was taking place then. And I was part of a very small group of computer writers then that we actually had a group ourselves because there were very few other computer writers in this little group in New York called the Lunch Group that met. And everyone would make the overt connection to rock and roll. The computers were the new rock and roll. And in 1982, Steve Wozniak threw a rock festival, and I covered it for Rolling Stone, and talked to Jerry Garcia, and he said technology is the new drugs. And I thought, yes, I'm here now. And one of the guys in the lunch group always would say, we're on the Led Zeppelin bus, the plane, the Led Zeppelin plane, which was like in the 70s, like the place to be where the rock and roll revolution was happening. And we were on the Led Zeppelin plane.
I guess Byte magazine was the closest to Rolling Stone in terms of covering that development.
Yeah, it certainly was. I was writing
in a sober way.
I was writing for Popular Computing, which was sort of the beginners. It was the entry drug into Byte, and and I did a column there. But I'd hang out at the Byte offices, and John Markoff was working there then, and it was real exciting, and it was great to be working on this there because no one really had looked back into where that all started then.
Right. So the occasion of publishing a new edition of this 25 years later, you had some of those folks you went back and talked to and say, kind of in the conventional way, where are they now?
Yeah, absolutely. It was, that was a really interesting experience of coming. Some of them, look, one of them was one of the key figures from MIT, and in a way, it's sort of poignant that these people who invented it really didn't participate in the bounty that came from the financial,
it's
rewards
another
of that.
analogy to sports, right?
Yeah.
Those early superstars like Jackie Robinson.
Yeah, they never got those contracts that Albert Pujols got.
Exactly.
And then like Lee, he's had a good career, but then again, he never hit it like Apple did, and but he's still teaching young hackers.
Right.
He runs this thing called the Hacker Dojo. And then I talked to Bill Gates.
Out at Mountain View, right?
Yeah.
And so that's another hacker space that's
and I talked to Bill Gates, of course. Who figures in the book not only as the guy who sees the Altair, but we haven't talked at all about the intellectual property wars, which really had their origin in this as the hacker ethic, as it first applied at MIT, ran and collided with the commercial world there. And Bill Gates, sort of put himself on the commercial side, and at one point wrote this very controversial letter, hobbyists calling them stealing software when they, basically just borrowed the tape and gave it back. What's stealing? Right. And but Bill, I talked to him a lot over the years. The very first time I talked to him was for Hackers. I interviewed him in, I think, 1980, maybe early '83, for the book. But since then, in journalism, I've interviewed him many, many times. And I had just one of the most fun interviews ever, returning to talk to him about this stuff, about the early days. And I asked him, I said, what would you do now? Now that computers are ubiquitous, would you be the same? Would you look in this? And he said, well, I'd probably be more interested in hacking biology now, because the Big Bang has happened already in computers. We did the Big Bang.
Right. He also says something in looking back. He says when we were doing this work, there really wasn't anybody older than us.
Yeah.
Which I thought was really an interesting remark, and to some degree I think that still is, whether the web or other things come along, that a new generation is kind of looking where there aren't a lot of people yet.
Right, and they don't know what's impossible.
Right.
And that
he talks about the intensity that was required to do this work.
Absolutely. So the early hackers, they didn't know it was impossible and ridiculous to use a computer to do your homework. Or play a game, build a game, right? And for Gates, his generation didn't think it was impossible that people would want computers on their desktops. The mission of Microsoft, right, eventually got formulated to put a computer in every desktop. And I'm writing a book now about Google, and they did something that the traditional information retrieval establishment didn't understand. Is with this thing called the web, there was an entirely different way to rank results when you were searching for something. It wasn't like looking at a static database sitting there on a computer. You had these links that you could use to really get incredibly effective searches over this giant body of work that people contributed to. They kept growing and growing and growing. So they, the founders of Google, Larry and Sergey, they saw this too, and they run their company from people who've grown up with the internet. That gives them an advantage over their competitors.
Right. So we have you're showing me earlier the iPhone 4. And it's kind of the latest crazy technology we have on hand, but it really does go back to its origins here, and the conflicts almost between open and closed.
Exactly.
And, the hacker ethics people say, it's not an open platform, and yet it comes out of the company that Wozniak and Jobs form, and who's sort of at a different end of the spectrum.
Right. That's where I think I really got lucky in looking at this thing, 25 that was, and documenting really what was happening in the 60s, some of these struggles there. But it certainly was important in the early 80s when I wrote about it, and it's just still a big issue now. I didn't realize that the open source movement would come up there. When I wrote the book, I actually thought the commercial side was going to win out there. Right. But fortunately I was wrong, that the hacker ethic was stronger than anyone thought, and that every time you put one of these devices that could do anything, right? These are dream machines with a blank slate. It sort of was an ambassador for the hacker ethic there. Mm-hmm. And the internet, which was built around those hacker principles, the hackers built the internet, right? Mm-hmm. Is the same kind of thing. It basically, every time you use the internet, the way it's structured, its open architecture, it sort of pushes you into saying you could get more done by being open, but by doing that. So this hacker ethic and their philosophy just thrives. But of course, on the other hand, there's these commercial schemes that see ways to profit by locking it down, and we still have this tension to this day.
And it's in many ways it's a fruitful tension. I don't know that we'll see it resolved in one side or the other.
Well, it is a fruitful tension, and you could arguably say that what's happened with the App Store and things like that is a blending of it. Another person I talked to for the new addition to the 25th anniversary is a couple people who weren't around when Hackers was written. One of them is Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook. And it's interesting because he grew up in an era, he didn't see these conflicts at all. He saw pursuing things in a hacking spirit yet in a commercial way presented no conflict at all.
Yeah.
You know, so he doesn't, you know, stay up at night thinking open, closed, open, closed. He just thinks cool stuff, cool stuff, cool stuff.
Well, I think even the word hacker has this. It doesn't mean one thing anymore. It has all these dimensions to it, and people can use it negatively.
Right.
They can use it positively. They can mean it in a very ordinary way. We can use it to talk these days about hacking our finances, or hacking, the garden. But it's like a lot of words. It has kind of, it's pulled together really different cultures, and it's a way of thinking about things.
I agree, but I think that's only kind of been restored in the past couple of years. Maybe Meg has something to do with it. But when the word first started being used in a pejorative sense, it was traumatic for a lot of the early hackers because the word didn't have that negative connotation to begin with. It was really a badge of honor among the early hackers to be called a hacker. If you were a hacker, you really knew your stuff, right? But then when it started being used for a term, it was almost synonymous with someone who would break into computers. Even the worst part, even someone with no talent who broke into a computer, just used a script or something like that. That was awful. And just in the last couple of years, we've seen sort of a restoration as another definition of it from that original sense. That
And I think the thing that it preserves in a way, because we have terms like computer science would suggest a lot of formality around computers and that we understand them. And hackers seems to be the craft, this kind of art that's passed on, from person to person, that's done in community, that I didn't know I could do that. I didn't know that the technology could do that. And it's a sense of wonder and exploration, all in that hacker culture.
Yeah, and absolutely. And it's great because the restoration of the word, and people, young people, really young people saying, I'm hacking at this and I'm doing that, I think just connects them with those early pioneers there. So, in a way, they finally get their dough.
Well, good. Well, thank you, Stephen, for your time today. And I just, just a personal plug on this book. It really is something that you ought to give a teenager today if they're at all interested in computers. It's a story. This isn't a tract. This is about how the early group of individuals came together and created something and really moved our way of thinking about technology in a completely new direction.
Yeah, well, it was my first book. I just really went for it and wanted to read like a novel and
How long did it take you to write it originally?
I wrote this book in under 2 years. I almost killed myself, but it was an amazing experience.
Oh, good. And it's republished now after 25 years, so you can find it on Amazon and the O'Reilly website. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you for speaking with me, Steve.
Thanks, Dale. It was a lot of fun.